October is National Domestic Violence Awareness Month here in the United States. On average, a victim of domestic violence will leave 7 times before actually leaving for good. So often, victims are afraid to speak out or to seek help for many reasons. Shame, guilt, fear, just to name a few. I want to encourage you to refrain from asking the question, if it was so bad, why didn't they just leave? Because it's not that easy, and if you've been fortunate enough to never have been in this situation or in this type of situation, consider yourself very fortunate, and please try and hold space for those who have been there and may still be. Today's case is truly heartbreaking. A young life was taken entirely too soon by someone she loved and cared about. What should have been some of the most exciting times of her life were ripped away from her. It's been over a decade, and the pain of losing Yardley Love is still heavy on the hearts for all of those who love her. Shortly after 2:15 on Monday, May 3rd, 2010, Felipe Alchern and Caitlin Whitley, 2 students at the University of Virginia, were headed back to Caitlin's apartment after a night out with some friends. Once they arrived at Caitlin's apartment, she decided she was going to wake up her roommate, Yardley Love. Yardley had been out with them earlier, but she wound up leaving and going home because she was feeling tired. But when Caitlin went to wake up Yardley, she noticed something weird on Yardley's door. And I think in this situation, anyone would immediately be concerned. There was a hole on the side of Yardley's door next to the doorknob, which was not there when they had left earlier. And when Caitlin opened Yardley's bedroom door, she did see Yardley laying on her bed face down in nothing but her underwear. Just to be sure that Yardley was okay, Caitlin kneeled down next to her to check on her, and as she did this, she sees something disturbing. Blood is pulled around Yardley's head. Caitlin begins shaking her friend, trying to get a response, anything but nothing. Yardley was not responding, so Caitlin ran out of the room to Felipe and has him call 911. The 911 operator asks him to check for a pulse, and when he does, he doesn't find one. So while the ambulance and the police are on their way to the apartment, Felipe tries CPR. But when the police and ambulance arrived, they are not fully aware of the extent of Yardley's injuries. They assumed Yardley had alcohol poisoning, but once they got into her room and they saw her, they knew that they were not dealing with alcohol poisoning. This was something much more sinister. They see a large pool of blood under her head coming from multiple cuts on her face, accompanied by a large bruise on the right side of her face, so bad that her right eye was completely swollen shut. When paramedics couldn't find a pulse, they began life-saving measures immediately to try and get her heart beating again. They worked for 24 minutes before realizing that their efforts were not enough and pronounced her dead at the scene. Once Yardley is pronounced dead, police immediately call for backup, and her apartment becomes a crime scene. It wasn't long before police noticed that Yardley's pillow, comforter, and sheets were stained with blood. But that's not all. They find blood all over the place. On her laptop case, the carpet, and the towels in her bathroom. They also notice a weird colored spot on her wall and a crushed can of beer in the trash can. Furthermore, they found hair, but the hair they found was stuck in the broken pieces of the hole in the door. They can't tell right away whose hair it was that they found, but they gathered all of the evidence collected and sent it off to the crime lab for testing. Felipe and Caitlin were taken to the police station for further questioning, and of course they wanted to know more about Yardley, who she was, where she had been in the hours and days prior, and if they had any idea who would want to do this to her. Investigators find out that Yardley was in her 4th year of college at UVA and would be graduating in just 2 short weeks. She and Caitlin both played on the women's lacrosse team at the time, and that team was actually ranked 4th in the nation, and Yardley would have been playing in the upcoming NCAA tournament. Yardley was loved. Everyone on the team loved her. She had lots of friends and was just all around a happy person. But of course, there was more to her life than only the good. Investigators found out from Felipe and Caitlin that Yardley had just broken up with her boyfriend. The 2-year relationship was on again, off again with a fellow student named George Huguely, who is also in his 4th year and also plays lacrosse. But with graduation fast approaching, Yardley decided to break things off with George about a month prior, but police learned that this relationship was not a healthy one. It was actually a very toxic relationship. Caitlin tells police about an email conversation that George and Yardley had recently had where George was extremely angry and was verbally abusive toward Yardley. She recalls Yardley telling her about the conversation and said that she was pretty upset. Following this, police proceed to gather as much information as possible about Yardley's relationship with George, as well as who he is as a person. They begin speaking to Yardley's friends, family, and even her neighbors to get a better sense of who George was and what their relationship was like. What they heard were some big red flags. Over and over again, they were told George had an anger problem, and sometimes that anger would become violent, especially when alcohol was involved. For example, the previous year, George punched a teammate while he was asleep because he thought his teammate had kissed Yardley. He sucker punched his teammate, attacking him in his sleep before even giving this person a chance to explain himself. And furthermore, just a few months before this, he was out drinking with friends and fellow lacrosse players, and George actually physically assaulted Yardley and had to be restrained by his fellow lacrosse player friends. Though there wasn't a police report filed on this attack, apparently George couldn't even remember that it happened because he was so drunk. Of course, investigators look into George's past to see if he has any type of criminal history, and not surprisingly, he does. When he was 19 in 2007, he was charged with possession of alcohol by a minor in Palm Beach, Florida. Also, in 2018, his dad called the Palm Beach police to report a domestic violence incident while the family was spending time on their yacht. And as far as who the domestic violence incident involved, aside from George, that has not been stated. But when this happened, the police showed up and George literally jumped off of the yacht into the ocean and began swimming to shore. He was ultimately picked up by another boat that was passing by and was not arrested for whatever apparently went down. But let's talk about George's last arrest before all of this. In 2008, George was arrested in Lexington, Virginia, at Washington and Lee University after he tried to walk into traffic while heavily intoxicated. An officer named Rebecca Moss found George and warned him he would be arrested if he did not find a ride home. After which he became violent and he attacked the officer. And while the two were literally wrestling, he yelled at her, quote, "I will kill all you bitches." Officer Moss wound up tasing George in order for him to stop trying to fight her, and he was charged with intoxication, resisting arrest, and public swearing. Eventually, he did plead guilty, but he claims he was so drunk that night, he really didn't remember much of anything that happened. Sounds familiar. He was fined a $100 fee and had to do 50 hours of community service and received a 60-day suspended sentence with 6 months probation. Surprisingly enough, because of the restrictions said to be set in place by the UVA, any student with a criminal background or prior arrest has to disclose that information to prevent students with violent pasts from going to this school. But apparently the lacrosse team also had an honor code that is similar, and if a student is arrested while attending the university, they are at risk of being expelled. But if you think that backgrounds were checked or the information disclosed was verified, you would be wrong. George should not still be a student at UVA at this point, given his background, but there he was attending this university, even though he had a criminal history, one that shows he can be violent at that. So at this point, police are preparing to go and find George and bring him in for questioning a little after 7 a.m. Before George is arrested, police receive information back from the crime scene techs who are processing Yardley's room and her apartment. Apparently, the only thing missing in her apartment was her laptop, and the police have been working with Yardley's roommate, Caitlin, to try and get a list together of anything else that could possibly be missing. So obviously, police suspect that whoever killed Yardley must have taken her laptop in an attempt to get rid of evidence. So they need to find that missing laptop because it may give them more information or evidence that they can use in court. So now they are ready to go and find George and bring him in for questioning. Now, I have heard that the police did not tell George that Yardley was dead. They apparently told him that they were investigating an assault. And if you watch the interrogation video, you don't see at any point them telling him that. But at one point, George does say, "Why did you tell me that you were investigating an assault and not that she was dead?" So I just wanted to put that out there. Watching his interrogation videos are a little frustrating because he says a lot of words without actually saying a whole lot. So it was a little hard to watch. They also let him know that he is being detained, which means that he is not allowed to leave whenever he wants. Just on observation, the investigators noticed bruising on George's knuckles and fresh cuts on his arms, which could be related to the fact that he does play lacrosse and he could have gotten those injuries during practice or even at a game. But that doesn't take away from the fact that investigators have to take those injuries into consideration, considering the type of injuries Yardley obtained. In the interrogation videos, he does say that those injuries are from lacrosse practice, but again, considering Yardley's injuries, it just little suspect. Investigators asked George what he did the day prior, and he claims that he went golfing for a little while with his dad and a couple of his friends, and he had about 4 to 5 beers. Then he went to dinner with those 2 friends and his dad, where he says he had 2 glasses of wine. After which he went to a local bar where he drank possibly 5 or so more beers. So he'd been pretty much drinking all day long. And after the bar, he decided to go over to Yardley's so that he could talk to her. He claims that Yardley immediately started acting really defensive because she had apparently attacked him the week prior. He claims that the week prior she had hooked up with someone else while they were still trying to figure things out. Although they weren't technically still together, this really upset George. And when he saw her a few nights later, George felt even worse, so he decided that he just wanted to go home. Apparently, at some point that night, he had 2 other girls over that were not students at UVA, but were actually still in high school and were just in town to visit. George claims that night, out of nowhere, Yardley came over and started to attack him. He says she hit him in the face and that it got so out of hand that his roommate and his girlfriend had to remove Yardley from their apartment. He is clearly trying to paint a picture here. Everything that we've heard about George clearly shows that he is violent, but here he is trying to make Yardley out to be the abusive one in their relationship. He continues to tell investigators that later he went to talk to her about what happened and about their relationship. He says that he was trying to make everything better. Investigators then ask George if Yardley was expecting him that night, and if she was, maybe that's why she had left her friends at the bar early and decided to go home. He says that he didn't know if she knew that he was coming, but that he had emailed her over the last few days, but that night he could not get a hold of her to tell her that he was on his way because she apparently lost her phone. So he just showed up at her apartment around 12:45 and just let himself in because he says that the door was not locked. But he claims her bedroom door was locked. He says that he asked her to let him in, and when she refused, he claims that he kicked a hole through the door to get into her room. When he did, he says that she started to freak out, which, I mean, I absolutely would have freaked out too, given their history together and the fact that he has a violent history. If I was in that situation and I didn't want someone to come in my room and they kicked a hole in the door to get in there, I would be freaking out too. This is 100% the start of a very scary situation. He goes on to claim that she got aggressive with him, which, whether she did or not, I feel like that is absolutely fair. I would say that in that situation, I would have got aggressive too. I definitely feel that's a moment that you would go into fight or flight mode. But he says she got aggressive with him. He claims that she pushed him and told him to leave. He says he refused to leave, and so she backed herself into a corner in her room just to get away from him, and claims that this was when things got weird. He says that she starts violently slamming her head against the wall and flailing herself. George goes on to say that when she started doing this, he grabbed her by her shoulders and started to shake her, telling her over and over again that they needed to talk about their relationship. He claims that while all of this was going on, she continued to slam her head against the wall over and over again, making sure to say that he never hit her. He continues to explain that eventually during this argument, they began to wrestle to the ground, and he says he then held her down. He said that her nose was now bleeding, and he felt as though this conversation was not going to go anywhere. So he says he threw her on the bed and left. He claims that all of this took place within no more than 10 minutes, and he says from Yardley's apartment, he went back to his apartment and went to sleep. I know how I'm feeling about this whole story, and I can't imagine how investigators are feeling about it. They obviously had some questions. Whatever happened to Yardley is not lining up with what George is claiming happened to her. Keep in mind that George thinks this is still about an assault, not a homicide. So as far as he knows, she's still alive, but the evidence doesn't lie, and George is throwing up some pretty big red flags. So to throw him off, they ask about Yardley's shirt because she was found in just her underwear. He says that when he left, she was wearing her t-shirt and her underwear, and states that she didn't try and fight back or defend herself against him. I don't know why he felt the need to say that, but he did. So at this point, investigators are still trying to locate the missing laptop. The crime scene is still being processed, but with no luck on finding the laptop. Initially, George says that he didn't take anything from her apartment, but they press him and he changes his story. He now claims that he did take Yardley's laptop and says he did this as collateral. So they ask him where the laptop is, and he says it's in his room before changing his story once again to say that the laptop is actually in a dumpster. Investigators are now sure that they got their guy. They know George has to be the person responsible for Yardley's death. And this is when they reveal to George that they are not investigating an assault, but that they are actually investigating Yardley's homicide. After accusing George of Yardley's murder, he denies that he killed her. And I mean, he denies that she's even dead. He goes into full on denial. Like, he is in denial for a hot minute during this interrogation. He says over and over, she's not dead. She's not dead. There is one point where he leans over and he does say, "You killed that poor girl." So he knows what he did. With everything that they've gathered through this investigation, from George's account of events and everything that they learned from Yardley's family and friends, they are certain that George is responsible. They arrest George for her murder, and they get a warrant to search his apartment. They removed 2 laptops from the apartment, but neither was Yardley's. Among other things, like a notebook, shower curtain, rugs, and the shorts George claimed to be wearing during the attack. They took swabs from his bathroom, the front door, the kitchen, and ultimately George pointed them to the dumpster that he said he threw out Yardley's laptop in. They immediately searched Yardley's laptop to find those emails between Yardley and George just days and weeks before Yardley's death. The email exchanges are wild. They start with Yardley sending an apology email to George, and his reaction is just a very angry rant, accusing her of sleeping with someone else in order to hurt him. And in another email, he asks her to help him make their relationship work. He's very hot and cold. One minute he is angry, and the next he wants to work it out. And what's even worse and absolutely terrifying, in one of their last emails he sends to her, he says, "When I found out about Mike Burns, I should have killed you." Which is the guy that she supposedly hooked up with when they were trying to work it out. When Yardley's autopsy results came back, they confirmed that her death was caused by blunt force trauma to the head. News of Yardley's death and George's arrest spreads around campus pretty quickly. Friends look back at their relationship and reflect on whether or not they saw any signs and if there was anything they possibly could have done to help Yardley to save her. Specifically, the lacrosse teams, both whom shared relationships with Yardley and George, but there was also talk about a code within the teams that would have prevented anyone from talking about all of the red flags in the first place. A lot of the teammates apparently didn't want to say anything because they might ruin the closeness that was shared between the teams. Some of their teammates witnessed George's huge red flag behavior, but no one came forward. No one said anything. Yardley's mom and some of her close friends did encourage Yardley to get a restraining order out against George, but she never did. It wasn't until after Yardley's death that some of her friends came forward and told police what George was really doing in the hours before Yardley's murder. If we go back to George's story, he tells police he left Yardley's apartment alone, but that was a lie. He wasn't alone. His friends tell police that after dinner with his dad, George and his friends went back to George's apartment to continue drinking. At about 11:40 p.m., everyone decided to go to the store and get some more beer, but George stayed behind. His friends say they were gone for maybe 20 minutes at most, and when they returned, George wasn't home. He returned shortly after they all got back, and he said he went to see some other teammates in another apartment building. His friends thought that this was a little odd because George was pretty intoxicated and he had no business going to another apartment building. They also said that he had a super weird blank look on his face, like clearly something was not okay. But they just didn't know what, so they brushed it off. And when they asked him if he was okay, his friends say that he just didn't say anything and just stood there and stared straight ahead at nothing. Even though his behavior was unusual, they assumed he was just super drunk, and again, they just brushed it off. So George is charged with first-degree felony murder, burglary, robbery, breaking and entering, and grand larceny because he stole Yardley's laptop. He pled not guilty, and the trial began on February 8th, 2012. The prosecution presents everything that they have, the emails, multiple testimonies from Yardley's friends and her teammates, as well as the weird colored spot on Yardley's wall, which is where they believe George repeated to slam her head against the wall. If you remember, there was also a beer can that they found in the trash and that hair that was stuck in the hole in the door, but they were not able to get any fingerprints off of the beer can and they couldn't identify who the hairs belonged to. But regardless, swabs taken from both George and Yardley prove that it was George who was in her room with her that night. The defense paints a different picture. They claim that when George went over to Yardley's apartment, he had no plans on hurting her. He just wanted to talk. They even bring up the fact that George had actually sent other students' messages that night asking if he could come over, arguing that he never planned on hurting Yardley. And they even claim Yardley died due to heart failure because of a combination of her Adderall prescription and drinking alcohol. Not only that, they also claim that her injuries were caused by incorrectly attempting CPR. Yardley was clearly beaten, and they're claiming that it was caused by incorrectly attempting CPR. Obviously, like all of us, the prosecution isn't buying this ridiculous story. They actually bring in UVA's primary care physician who works with UVA's student athletes, Dr. Danny Mystery, and he testifies that they perform EKGs for all student athletes who use Adderall, since taking it in high doses can result in heart problems. But according to him, Yardley was not abusing her prescription, and Yardley had 10 times less than the lethal amount of Adderall in her system. 10 times less. Dr. Mystery states that Yardley had 3 screenings in her time at UVA, including her most recent screening being in September of 2009. And none of those screenings found any abnormalities with her heart. The prosecution bring in multiple medical professionals who state that there was nothing wrong with her heart, reiterating that the only conclusion as to the cause of Yardley's death was blunt force trauma to the head. This was the argument that the defense was arguing the entire time. But after this, the defense changed their argument, and now they are claiming that Yardley died by suffocation from laying face down on her pillow. But again, probably like all of us, I'm sure, the jury is not buying this equally ridiculous story either. And on February 23rd, they found George guilty. They found him guilty for larceny and second-degree murder, and he is found not guilty for the felony murder and the robbery, burglary, and breaking and entering charges. In the end, George is sentenced to 23 years without the possibility of parole. George goes on to appeal his conviction multiple times, but it is upheld every time. Following all of this, Yardley's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against George, and they were awarded $15 million in damages. They also established an organization called One Love to help prevent another tragedy like this from happening again. This organization helps educate young people to understand the difference between healthy and unhealthy relationships. They hold workshops about the signs of abusive relationships and how to find resources that will be helpful to those who are experiencing abuse. To this day, One Love has helped educate millions of young people. And I feel like people often jump to the thought of, if it was so bad, why didn't they just leave? And I want to reiterate here that it's just not that easy. After watching the interrogation videos with George, I personally, this is just my opinion, I believe that he didn't necessarily intend on killing Yardley, but I don't think that he was there to not hurt her. I definitely think he intended on hurting her. He had a history of that in the past. She was obviously in an abusive relationship and people saw it and no one said anything. She didn't even say anything because it isn't easy. On average, someone in an abusive relationship will leave many times before they actually leave for good, and that's the most dangerous time in that person's situation. I don't believe that George intended on killing Yardley, but that's what happened. He had a history of getting drunk and blacking out and being violent, and this time he took it too far. Abuse is not always physical either. It can be mental and emotional as well as financial, and every situation is different, and it's never easy to leave, nor is it easy to reach out for help. But if you find yourself in an abusive situation, I encourage you to reach out for help, whether it's a hotline or someone you trust. Just always trust your gut. Even if you've been isolated and you feel like you've lost all of your friends and your family, I am here to tell you that I can relate, and I promise you they are still there for you and they still love you and they will always be there for you. I will link One Love's website in the description if you'd like to look it over. It is a great resource. And I just want you to know that you are not alone and you don't have to navigate this transition alone. That is all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.